The lights on the real-time stage burned brighter than usual that night. You could feel it, the kind of brightness that wasn't meant to illuminate but to expose. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett walked in with calm precision, every step a silent declaration that she wasn't here to play by someone else's script. Bill Maher, sharp as ever, leaned back in his chair like a man ready to test the limits of civility itself. And from the moment he smirked, everyone in that studio knew this wasn't just a talk show, it was a courtroom dressed as comedy. What happened first was subtle. Maher welcomed her with a grin that carried more warning than warmth. Why? Because he was setting the stage, making sure the audience knew who held the mic, how the game was played, and where the real power supposedly sat, right under his desk next to the cue cards. The moment she sat down, the tension crackled like static before a storm. Maher's first jab came wrapped in humor. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett joins us tonight, a rising star if she can keep her emotions in check. The crowd laughed. Crockett didn't. That's when the courtroom bell metaphorically rang. The charge? Emotion. The accusation, that her passion was political theater. She looked at him with a calm that could freeze an inferno. Her eyes said, "Go ahead, try me." Then came the opening argument. Maher leaned forward, his voice dripping with that signature blend of wit and warning. Why do progressives feel the need to moralize everything? But Crockett wasn't biting the bait, she was about to flip the whole table. Because, she began, her tone measured, every time young people, especially young black women, care about something it gets labeled emotional. Not principled, not rational, just emotional. The audience murmured, some in agreement, some in discomfort. That was the what. The why was deeper. She was unmasking the cultural reflex that silences conviction by mocking it. Maher chuckled lightly, sensing his narrative slipping. But don't you think Congress has become more of a stage lately? Everyone's trying to go viral instead of govern. A classic pivot. He was shifting the frame from her message to her medium. But Crockett's response cut through the air like a clean blade. Congress has always been a stage, Bill. The difference is now that someone new is reading from the script. Suddenly everyone's calling it theater. The audience gasped, then applauded. Tension, release, a punchline wrapped in truth. For a second, Maher's smirk flickered. She wasn't defensive, she was deliberate. And that's what made it sting. The way she said it wasn't loud, but it landed. Like a sniper, not a brawler. Then came the escalation. Maher nodded, pretending to agree while slipping in another jab. That's a good soundbite, he said dismissively, his tone somewhere between patronizing and performative. A lesser guest might have smiled politely. But Crockett, she leaned in just enough to shift the balance of power. It sounds distinct, she said coolly, because I didn't need to raise my voice to make the point. Boom. The studio went quiet for a heartbeat. Even Maher blinked. The what was a clapback, the why was control, the who, a woman who had mastered the art of restraint as resistance, and how she did it by turning his own format into her witness stand. Maher, now clearly intrigued, went for his closing argument, or what he thought was one. Look, he said, effective leadership means being able to take criticism. Not every challenge is oppression. The crowd hummed in agreement. It was the kind of line designed to look reasonable but built to corner her. The what was a dismissal, the why to redefine the debate on his terms. But Crockett was 3 moves ahead. She smiled, the kind of smile that warns of incoming intellectual artillery. Deflection, she replied simply. You frame calling out a pattern as oversensitivity so you can avoid acknowledging it. She didn't just counter his point, she named his move. That's the courtroom equivalent of catching a lawyer faking evidence while the jury's still watching. And then she struck the identity nerve that made every woman who's ever been told to calm down sit up in her seat. When you challenge people, it's called brave. When I do it, it's called emotional. That's not civility, Bill, that's a double standard. The crowd erupted, half applause, half shock. Maher tried to interject, but the sound drowned in the audience's reaction. And then came the line, the one that would later explode across the internet like wildfire. She looked directly into the camera, voice steady, eyes fierce. I am being civil, I'm just not being small. It wasn't shouted, it was declared like a verdict. And for a moment, even Maher went silent. You could practically hear the production crew realizing they just witnessed a quote that would outlive the episode itself. But this was only the beginning. Because what happened next didn't happen in the studio, it happened online. Within minutes, the clip spread like digital lightning. The how was through 1,000 tiny edits, TikToks, GIFs, and looping Twitter clips with captions like "This is power." The who, people tired of being told to shrink. The why, because they saw themselves in that calm defiance. And the what, a quote that turned restraint into revolution. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. The same media that had ignored her points suddenly couldn't shut up about her tone. Headlines bloomed overnight. Crockett lashes out on Maher. Fiery exchange erupts. Tense showdown over civility. Funny, isn't it, how calm becomes fiery the moment it challenges comfort? The irony was almost poetic. The what, they called her angry. The why, because she refused to perform submission. The who, the same pundits who praise men for being passionate. And the how, by weaponizing adjectives that rewrite perception. Fiery sells more clicks than composed. Crockett, however, didn't flinch. No frantic tweets, no self-defense threads, she just went quiet, and that silence was deafening. She knew the difference between a reaction and a response. Her focus shifted from the digital circus to the ground game, visiting high schools, meeting with grassroots organizers. Right when the media expected her to explode, we're back among the people who actually listen. Her silence became a statement louder than any headline. I don't need your noise to validate my power. But the internet has the memory of a hurricane. It cycles fast, forgets faster. The memes kept coming, the edits got bolder, even Maher's fans began debating whether he'd been outmaneuvered on his own show. Some called her performance too smooth to be spontaneous, as if composure itself was suspicious when held by a woman of color. That's the real tension, isn't it? Power disguised as poise terrifies people who rely on chaos to win arguments. Still, what made this story remarkable wasn't the viral moment, it was the aftershock. Weeks later, clips of Crockett's line were being used in motivational edits, corporate trainings, even classroom discussions about communication and presence. I am being civil, I'm just not being small. It was quoted like scripture, dissected like poetry, and turned into merch faster than you could say trending. But beneath the spectacle was a blueprint, a quiet manifesto for anyone who's ever been told to dilute themselves to fit in. Crockett didn't just defend her dignity, she redefined civility itself. She proved that control isn't silence, it's strategy. And that's what Maher never saw coming, because in that exchange he wasn't debating a guest, he was facing a mirror reflecting every unexamined bias he'd ever joked through. Still, in fairness, Maher didn't crumble. He recovered with a grin, tossed another quip to lighten the air. Well, Jasmine, he said, if that's civility, I might start being rude just to keep up. The crowd laughed, tension release, but underneath you could feel his respect growing in real time. He tried to corner her, instead he'd been cornered by clarity. What happened next shocked the entire studio. During the after-show segment, Maher tried to pivot back to safer ground, joking about how politicians needed thicker skin. But Crockett cut in, this time softly, almost gently. It's not about skin, Bill, it's about space. Some of us are just done apologizing for taking it. Silence again, not tense, not hostile, reverent. It was the sound of a room realizing that what just happened wasn't argument, it was awakening. And here's the paradox that made it beautiful. Crockett never shouted. She never raised her hand or voice, yet she left an entire stage and half the country reevaluating what power looks like when it refuses to shrink. That night wasn't a debate, it was a reckoning. Because when the cameras shut off and the audience filed out, Jasmine Crockett didn't bask in the applause or scroll through the instant praise. She simply exhaled, a long, quiet breath that sounded like relief and resolve woven together. The what was silence. The why, because not every victory needs a victory lap. The who, a woman who had learned that real power doesn't chase validation. The how, by letting her composure finish the argument for her. Meanwhile, the media did what the media always does. They chewed the clips, swallowed the nuance, and spat out caricatures. Talk show pundits debated whether she'd been too sharp. Commentators described her tone like it was a criminal record, fiery, snappy, bold, unapologetic. It was the classic cycle. The more measured her words, the more the world called her emotional. The more logical her argument, the more they called it attitude. But Crockett knew this rhythm too well. She'd been fighting these same invisible battles since her first campaign, when articulate was offered like a compliment and passionate like a warning. The courtroom of public opinion has always been harsher to those who refuse to play small. So while cable news hosts twisted her interview into clickbait, Crockett went back to work. Meetings, policy sessions, quiet, unglamorous hours. She visited a local high school where a student asked, "Ma'am, how do you stay calm when they try to make you angry?" Crockett smiled, because that was the real audience, not the one sitting under studio lights. By remembering, she said, that calm isn't weakness, it's control. That line didn't trend, it didn't need to, but for that young girl who asked the question, it became armor. Every hero in these courtroom dramas, real or fictional, faces the same test. Can they stay focused when the crowd wants a spectacle? Crockett passed that test by refusing to perform rage just to make truth entertaining. She wasn't there to prove she could shout, she was there to prove she didn't have to. But let's rewind to that night once more, because the energy that followed her off stage was unlike anything the real-time studio had seen. Maher, ever the veteran performer, came up to her backstage and said quietly, "You know, that was one hell of a comeback." She smiled. "It wasn't a comeback, Bill," she said. "It was clarity." Then she shook his hand and walked away. That exchange never made it on air, but staff members whispered about it for days. Because behind all the political theater, there's something magnetic about a person who refuses to flinch in the face of condescension and still leaves the room lighter than they found it. The internet, meanwhile, continued its feeding frenzy. Edits of her quote, "I'm being civil, I'm just not being small," appeared over footage of courtroom showdowns, protest clips, and even scenes from movies like Hidden Figures and The Woman King. People had turned it into a rallying cry. And the why was obvious. Everyone knows what it feels like to be told to shrink for someone else's comfort. But the double-edged sword of virality is that the meaning often gets lost in the echo. Some influencers twisted her message into sound bites about being loud and proud, missing that her power came from restraint, not volume. She wasn't advocating rebellion for rebellion's sake, she was demonstrating the elegance of unshakable self-respect. Still, Crockett didn't correct them, because every interpretation meant the same thing in spirit. Someone somewhere saw her and decided they didn't need to apologize for existing at full size. And that's how legacies begin, not through control of narrative, but through resonance. Weeks passed, and Maher's episode faded from the trending lists, but the ripples it left didn't. A journalist wrote an op-ed calling the moment a masterclass in emotional intelligence. A university communications course added the exchange to its syllabus under tone and power in public discourse. Even political consultants began quietly using her performance as a case study in strategic calm. Because what Crockett proved in front of millions was that composure can be louder than confrontation. That a whisper, when perfectly timed, can silence an entire room. Let's break that tension loop again. Maher thought he was hosting a conversation about civility. But what he accidentally hosted was a live experiment in what civility looks like when it's no longer defined by the comfort of the powerful. And here's the truth, Crockett wasn't even trying to win that night. She was modeling what it looks like to stand your ground without raising your temperature, modeling how to meet arrogance with precision, modeling that for young women who have been taught that diplomacy means disappearing. The what, a verbal duel on television, the why, to expose a double standard, the who, a congresswoman who refuses to bow to tone policing, the how, through quiet dominance, the when, in a moment where the world rewards outrage. The where, on a stage built for mockery but converted into a classroom for power. But Crockett didn't stop there. Off camera, she kept doing the work that doesn't trend, drafting proposals, mentoring interns, showing up to community events without press coverage. Her staff joked that she could go viral every week if she wanted, but Crockett had already learned the most important rule of modern politics: virality fades, but credibility compounds. Then came the backlash. Predictably, a few conservative commentators mocked her as too polished, claiming she rehearsed her authenticity. The irony was painful. They mocked her calm as artificial and her conviction as vanity, because when a woman leads with reason, they call it manipulation. When she leads with emotion, they call it madness. And yet, every insult just confirmed her point. Her supporters clapped back online with a new phrase: "Stay civil, stay big." It wasn't just fandom, it was movement energy, small but growing. Teachers used the clip in classrooms to show how tone and body language can shift authority. Office managers shared it in meetings about assertiveness. Even therapists referenced it in sessions about emotional regulation and identity safety. The why was universal. Everyone is tired of pretending that confidence is aggression just because it's coming from the wrong mouth. Still, Crockett remained grounded. She didn't lean into the icon label. In one radio interview, she laughed and said, "I'm not trying to go viral, I'm just trying to go to work." It was simple, but beneath that humility was strategy, because she understood that every time she refused to be sensationalized, she turned the media's game inside out. And that's the twist Maher never predicted. He thought he was moderating a debate about civility, but what he moderated was his own education in controlled resistance. Months later, when another guest on his show brought up the moment, Maher smirked and said, "She handled herself well, better than I expected." That line alone told you everything. Even he had learned something, not just about Crockett, but about what true professionalism looks like when it refuses to yield to stereotypes. Let's end where it began: a stage, a spotlight, and a woman walking and knowing she might be ambushed. The what, a televised debate. The why, a test of civility. The who, two public figures embodying two very different definitions of respect. The how through words that cut without wounding. The when in a time when conversation itself has become combat. The where on a show that prides itself on discomfort. And yet, Crockett turned discomfort into a weapon sharper than outrage. She walked in accused of being too emotional. She walked out having redefined what emotion looks like when it's disciplined, dignified, and deliberate. Her quote still circulates, detached from its origin. I am being civil, I'm just not being small. But that's the point. Great lines don't belong to the moment, they belong to whoever needs them next. The office worker standing up to a dismissive boss. The student refusing to downplay their talent. The friend learning to say no without guilt. Crockett's composure became their permission slip. Because the legacy of that night isn't a viral clip, it's a quiet revolution in posture. A lesson that civility isn't compliance and grace isn't weakness. If power had a sound that night, it wasn't a shout. It was the pause between words, the measured breath before the truth lands, the stillness that follows when the room finally realizes who's really in control. So when people ask, what made that exchange unforgettable? The answer isn't that Crockett humiliated Maher. She didn't need to, she did something rarer. She exposed the architecture of tone politics brick by brick without ever raising her voice. And in doing so, she left us with a verdict that still echoes long after the credits rolled. Volume is not required for power. And if your presence makes others uncomfortable, you're probably standing in the right place.